All right, guys, today we are back and we're talking about one of my absolute favorite topics. This is a guy by the name of Thomas Paine. And I'm going to show you his face here a little bit closer. This is his portrait. This is one of the heavy hitters, right? He's one of the big dogs of this era. And he's an author, he's a patriot, and he really kind of becomes the voice of that generation almost, or a voice of the revolution. His ideas are really revolutionary. They stoke the flames of this revolution. I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened without him, but it certainly solidified the idea of revolution, the idea that freedom and liberty are things worth fighting for. So he was a big voice at that time. Now, what we're going to see is that his work is really very accessible. It is something that everybody can understand. The literacy rates at that time were extremely high. Now, that's important because everybody can read, but that doesn't mean that everybody's highly educated. We've all known people who have their PhD and master's degrees and all these different kinds of things. And it's almost like when they talk to you, they forget how to speak to normal people. They want to show you how smart they are. They want to show you how educated they are. They want to show you how much better they are than you by using the big words and using the jargon. Well, he writes in the vernacular. And if you don't know what vernacular means, it's basically just common language. He writes in the way people of the day spoke. Instead of trying to show off, instead of trying to let you know how smart he spoke like a common person, just a normal person. And that made it accessible. Certainly the academic world would have been able to understand him, but so would the farmers, so would the merchants, so would the dock workers and carpenters and shipbuilders and all those sorts of things, right? So it's accessible to everybody. That's an important point here for Thomas Paine. Now, he's going to be the author of a of what we call a pamphlet, right? It's a very short book called Common Sense. Excuse me. Now, Common Sense is first and foremost, it's a work of propaganda. But before we go any further, let's do talk a little bit about propaganda, because I think that word leaves a bad taste in most people's mouths. We think of propaganda as being false, misleading, dishonest, manipulative, and that's been brought about because we see things like Russian propaganda during the Cold War or Nazi propaganda during World War II. But I want to put all that stuff aside. Um, Propaganda, in its most simple definition, really is just simply trying to influence our attitudes and behaviors, trying to move us in a certain direction in our thoughts. And so common sense certainly does that. He's trying to make the argument for freedom, for liberty, and against monarchy. And so, in that way, this is a work of propaganda. But please understand that just because it's propaganda doesn't mean that it's inherently untrue. Propaganda can be false, it can be misleading, but it can also just as much be about facts, trying to get people to change their attitudes, change their behaviors based on factual information as well. So, what we're going to see is that Thomas Paine is a really good kind of Enlightenment style writer. He kind of marries the Enlightenment with the Great Awakening because this is written in almost a sermon type style, which again makes it very accessible to people. He's going to make very logical arguments that's going to appeal to maybe people more scientific minded. He's also going to make very emotional arguments, and we're all susceptible to emotional arguments. This is going to be a book that really inflames the passions of a large part of society. Really kind of allows them to feel that anger, feel that desire for something greater. And in this case, it's liberty. Now, for a lot of people, he gives voice to what they were already feeling, right? Many people already kind of inherently felt like freedom was important, that liberty was something that was worth fighting for, and yet they could never really articulate those things, right? A select few could. But Thomas Paine kind of gives voice to all of these people and what they're already feeling. And so it solidifies for them. And not only does it solidify their thoughts, but it gives them the arguments to make. So it's almost as if he's helping them find their tongue, right? Their voice for all of this. And it really strengthens their resolve. So after this book is published, and it's a huge bestseller, right? This outsells everything. It outsells the Bible. And think about that. In an era that is just after the Great Awakening, when so many people are reawakened to religion, the Bible sells incredibly well. Everybody has a copy. But this book outsells that during the year that it's published. It was setting fire throughout the colonies, right? People would read it and they'd dog ear it and they'd make notes in the margins and they'd reread it and then they'd pass it along to friends, neighbors, and loved ones, right? So it was a highly read argument, a highly read plea for freedom and democracy. Now, the next thing that we see, he pops up again. We're going to see him in the midst of the revolution, and he writes another great work called The American Crisis. This is a big deal because while Common Sense was written to everybody, right? This anybody can read, but it's really specifically for the soldiers. The reason for that is because he understands that the soldiers are very demoralized. They are facing what seems like impossible odds. You're fighting against the British. This is the biggest, most powerful, most well organized and funded war machine that the world has at this point. And to face them is pretty daunting. In addition to that, our army is starving, they're poorly provided for. They are outnumbered. There's any number of different things. There's disease. It is just a terrible situation. Because of that, they are abandoning their post, abandoning the army by the thousands. So Thomas Paine says, we've got to do something about this. He writes The American Crisis. It's a series of essays that really helps to fortify these men. He's writing to them as one of them. So basically, this American Crisis, it reminds the troops who they are, why they were fighting, right? It reminds them of how precious and fragile liberty and freedom and democracy can be. So the fact that it has value, it's worth fighting for. And then lastly, he reminds them of their place in history. He basically says this, guys, you are immortal. You are immortal. The whole world will remember what you do here during these war years. If we are successful, this will have shaken the very foundations of the globe. Right? The world will never be the same after this. So again, he reminds them who they are. He reminds them why they fight, and he reminds them of their place in history. So I'm going to zoom in on this because it has the very beginning of the very first essay of American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. But we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. So those are big words. And again, it really fortifies these people. Now, one of the things that I love about Thomas Paine, one of the reasons that we study him and are not only his words, but this is a man of convictions, right? He believes in what he's saying. There are a lot of people who benefit from war. There are a lot of people who get rich off of other people's hardships and difficult situations. Thomas Paine certainly could have been one of those people. He could have made a lot of money from his books, but here's the thing. In writing this, he's basically committing treason. These are treasonous writings. And if you don't know, the penalty for treason is death. The next thing we're going to see is that he put his life on the line, not just because of what he wrote, but he volunteered. He volunteered for service in the military. He becomes a personal aide to one of the Continental Army's generals. And then finally, every dollar that he earned from the publishing of these two incredibly well-selling works, he donated back to the cause of freedom. He gave it back to help fight against the British. So this is a guy who's willing to put his money where his mouth is, and that's a pretty rare quality. So that's a pretty big deal. I love some Thomas Paine. In my class, we call him T. Paine, right? So anyway, that's Thomas Paine, American Crisis, Common Sense, and a little bit of the impact that they had. I would encourage you, feel free to leave comments below. You can go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We're producing new videos every day, and in the hopes that little bite-sized chunks that we can learn something. So anyway, would love to hear from you. Please go ahead and submit or subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys.